So now you should be feeling pretty good about this install. If you look at our table here of parts, we're down to very few items left. And in this step, we're gonna install the transmission and the drive shaft. One thing to note, this is a Mark IV Supra, so this shifter, depending on which chassis you're installing my kit in, it might use this straight shifter, the factory shifter, or it might use the relocation shifter. So in this application, the Mark IV Supra, we use the relocation shifter, so I'm gonna change the shifter out to this, and then we're gonna go ahead and put the trans up in the car using the hardware provided. So for the video, I put this shifter on because I wanted to show you the difference between the straight shifter that comes on the Magnum-F from the factory versus the relocation shifter that comes in the Mark IV kit. So when you get this trans in the box in my kit, it's already gonna have the shifter on, it's gonna be sealed, ready to go. So I have that set up for you based on whatever kit you buy from me. Just like I trim the transmission for whatever kit you buy for. So that's all done. Now before we go to put this trans in, the one thing I like to do is I like to take this line off and just breathe, like put some pressure through it and just make sure that this valve is working properly. I've had some defective ones, so just make sure that this actually will pop open when you put pressure through it with your mouth. Now, the other thing I do is I put one of the bolts from the hardware here, from one of these 8 bolts with a high collar washer and a regular washer on this to begin with, because it's really hard to get to when you're up in the car to get it through this bracket that holds the breather tube. So put your bolt in there first. Now we're gonna go ahead and put this trans up in the car. Now with the motor leaned up in the front, so we're leaning downward, and the trans on a trans jack, I have the trans kind of leaning at the same angle. This should slide on relatively easy. So this is my first attempt, so hopefully it works out the way I think it should. One of the trickier things is rotating the trans, and if you're on the ground, you know, it's definitely a lot harder. I have a lift here with a trans jack, so it makes it a lot easier on my end, especially when I'm by myself. But I know a lot of you guys are going to be doing this from the ground, so I've been there, done that. I'm very privileged to have this lift and this setup now, and I don't know how I ever did it without it, to be totally honest. But I definitely remember the days of putting these in on the ground, bench pressing them in, basically. But let's go ahead and give this a shot. We're going to go try to slide the trans on the bell housing and see what happens. So basically you're going to want to slide the the input shaft into the clutch fingers, and then get your trans up to the level of where the pilot is going to go through the center of the clutch hubs. And we're going to try to slide this on all the way, and you have to kind of play with it to get it to go on the hub first. And I usually kind of lift up and wiggle around here to get this to go on. And it's kind of hard because that light I set up over there is shining right into my eyes. Okay, I'm in the first hub of the disc. So sometimes it takes going up and down a little bit to kind of get that angle perfect to where it'll slide in easier for you. Seems like I slid out of that first disc, you know. Okay, I'm gonna pause this and try to fight with this a little bit and get it to go in place. Okay, so you can see that I am almost all the way on. I'm basically on the nipple where it needs to go into the pilot bearing. So before I do that and push it all the way the rest on, I wanna check here and make sure that my lines are not getting pinched. So you wanna look at these here and make sure your lines don't go in between here. So you wanna make sure they're pushed back and coming through this hole. You don't wanna pinch them or it will ruin them basically. So just check that out before you push this on the rest of the way. And sometimes this takes a little bit of like fighting to get it to go into the pilot. You have to kind of wiggle it and kind of manhandle it on there is usually what happens when you get to this point. Sometimes it slides right on, no issue. Other times it fights a little bit, and this one fought me a little bit, but it's not too bad. We're almost on now. So after you get the trans going onto the bell with the dowels right here, so after you get it lined up, you can start a bolt on each side like this. You don't want to pull the bell or pull the trans on with these bolts, but you can use them to help give you leverage. So you're going to start them, and that'll help keep you lined up, and then you can kind of wiggle and shimmy the trans onto the bell. All right, you can see I have 2 bolts in here now tightened down. The bell is flush with the trans now, so I can install the rest of the bolts. Now, the one thing you can take a look at here is you can kind of put your light in here and look at the bearing, and you can kind of see that there's some gap there. It's hard to tell, but you can kind of tell. You'll be able to tell better after you bleed the clutch, but that's just something you can kind of take a look at. You should not have the fingers pressing up against the bearing at this point. Now, the other thing to note is on this bell, some of the holes are tapped less and have less clearance than others, like that one up there. So on this one, the one where I trim the trans and trim the bell, you typically want to put 2 washers on that location. That's why I include 1 extra washer for that bolt specifically right there. The rest of them, I'll just get 1 bolt, 1 washer, except for that one. So I'm going to go ahead and install the rest of the bolts from the trans into the bell, and then we're going to go ahead and install the cross member. All right, so we're looking pretty good here. The trans is all installed. All 8 bolts are in place. So these bolts, I don't really have a torque spec for them, but I usually go about 55 to 60 foot-pounds on these. I tighten them pretty tight. They have lock washers on there, so they shouldn't back out. So the next step then is installing the Prothane mount and the cross member. And we're gonna go ahead and remove our exhaust jack on the front or whatever you have propping the motor up so that the motor can now go up, or the trans can go up in the back. So we're gonna remove that, get the cross member installed, and that's pretty much it. We got the trans in place. We can put fluid in it, put the drive shaft in, and man, we're getting close. I hope you're feeling good about this now because we are nearing the end. So the Prothane mount is pretty simple. It has 2 studs that you'll install with these standard washers and lock washers and the nuts. And then the bolts that go into the trans I provide you, which is these 2 here. So we're gonna go ahead and install this. We're not gonna tighten these down. We're gonna leave them loose for now, just until we get the cross member situated and in place where we want it. We're gonna leave all these bolts pretty much loose until we get them exactly where we want them. I'm gonna go ahead and install this, install the cross member onto the Prothane, and I'll come back for the hardware that goes from the cross member into the body. So I have the Prothane installed, and I went ahead and torqued these down to about 45 foot-pounds, maybe 50 foot-pounds. Like I said, I don't really use torque specs for these bolts that just secure everything. What I usually do is I put the cross member up in place here, and I just make sure that this is aligned properly so that all the bolt holes line up. And then I go ahead and come back and tighten these up. And then I put the cross member on, and I don't tighten these down, and I don't tighten any of these down until I have it all kind of lined up where I want it. So I'm gonna go ahead and install the cross member now, and we'll come back. I have the cross member all installed and tightened down here. I have these ones loose, and the reason I have these ones loose is because I want to show you how tight the reverse lockout is. So this Magnum-F is a little bit different than the regular Magnum because the tail case is different, and it puts this reverse lockout in a little bit different location. It's higher and more to the left. So what it does is it kind of interferes with the tunnel there. You can see how tight that gap is. It's not quite touching, but it's really close. And if the trans vibrates, it might vibrate a little bit and resonate through the chassis. So what I recommend doing is taking a pry bar and going up in here like this and pushing over on the trans a little bit. And you can see when I push over, it moves those bolts just slightly. And that'll give you a little more clearance. And then after you tighten down, you can, after you tighten these 2 bolts down, they're 18 millimeters or 11/16. You can tighten those 2 down and then come back, and you can actually pry a little bit more on there, and it will actually clearance that tunnel a little bit with the pry bar. So the pry bar is gonna mechanically move that tunnel out more towards the interior of the car, which will give you a little more breathing room for that reverse lockout. All right, so my cross member bolts are tightened down here, and you can see where I put the pry bar up in there and kind of pushed over on the tunnel a little bit to give me some more clearance. And now I have about 1/8 of an inch of breathing room for that reverse lockout, so we're in good shape. So now that the trans is installed, we can install the drive shaft, and then we're gonna go ahead and put fluid in the trans. Well, our parts table is looking really good now. So the next step here is the drive shaft. And this is the DSS driveshaft shop unit with the billet yoke for the Magnum-F. And it comes with the billet adapter for the 200mm diff. So basically we're gonna take this off, this billet adapter, we're gonna install it onto the diff first, and then we're gonna slip the drive shaft onto the trans, and then bolt the rear yoke onto the adapter flange. So I have the billet adapter installed onto the diff flange, and on all the bolts here on the diff side, I use a little bit of red Loctite. So I use red Loctite on all three of these, just because they see some vibration. And speaking of vibration, one thing that you can do, so if you install this in the car and you get a little bit of vibration, it seems like it's coming from the back of the car, these are machined really precisely to be on this nipple that comes off the diff, but they can be off center very slightly, and that could be causing a little bit of vibration. So to improve that, what you can do is you can, just like we did on our bell housing, you can put a dial indicator on here, and you can spin this, and you can watch your dial indicator and see if this is sitting just slightly off center, and you can adjust that to help with vibration. So on these hex head bolts, when you go to bolt this drive shaft into the adapter, you want to leave the drive shaft slid back a little bit and start each bolt and get them in past the yoke flange here, because these hex heads will kind of want to interfere here. So you want to make sure you get them all started. Be careful not to cross thread, because this is just aluminum. And then I red Loctite these as well, and I take them down to about 60 foot-pounds. Now, the other thing to note is these drive shafts that are done by Drive Shaft Shop, this yoke on the front side here is machined to fit, because we found that none of the yokes actually fit 100% proper. So they cut the end off and they machine it. If this yoke has trouble sliding on to the output shaft, it might need filed a little bit, because they machine that end, and sometimes there can be a little bit of burrs on those splines. So you might have to file that a little bit to get this to slide on smooth. Once the companies come out with a yoke that fits properly, then you won't have to worry about that. So that should be in the near future. But for now, I want to make sure I point that out just in case. So let's talk about gear oil, because that's going to be our next step. So the transmission fluid that you want to run is Tremec MKIV. That's what they recommend. However, for break-in, since we're just going to be breaking this trans in, we're not going to be pushing it really hard for about 200, 300 miles, you can use any off-the-shelf fluid that is close to what Tremec recommends. Now, Tremec MKIV is 75-85, so really like the closest I could find at Napa was 80-90, and this is perfectly fine for a break-in period. So after you go through your break-in period, you can go ahead and swap out to 4 quarts, or it's actually 3.7 quarts of Tremec MKIV. So I'm gonna go ahead and put all my fluid in this gallon jug, and I'm gonna transfer it in with my pump setup here that I built. So our trans is now filled with fluid. If you're doing this by hand, it sucks, because you have to use the squeeze bottle and push it up in there. But if you can find a fluid transfer pump, it's gonna make your life a lot easier. This thing, I use this on every single car I work on, and it works so great. So I would recommend some sort of fluid transfer pump to make it easier on your end. So we're almost done now with this part of the video. The last step then is gonna be to bleed the clutch. So we're gonna go there next. So before we can bleed the clutch, we gotta install the clutch line. Now, if you're getting this kit from me, this fitting, the 90-degree angle fitting, goes up on the master cylinder end, and then this line snakes down through the engine bay, and then you have a 3AN to 4AN union here. So the Tilton 6000 bearing is a 4AN line, so we're gonna adapt it using this union fitting. So I'm gonna go ahead and install the line, and then we'll come back to bleeding the clutch. On the bottom side, your clutch line connects with that union fitting that I just showed you here to the feed line on the bearing. And then you snake the line up through the body, or up through the engine bay, up to where the master is. So I'm gonna go ahead from the top now, and we're gonna install the line from the top. Here you can see the clutch master cylinder and the clutch line installed from the top. Now, I did install all this with all the ABS unremoved. It was a little bit tight to get in there, but I've done this a couple times, so it was pretty easy on my end. You might want to pull this ABS cylinder up out of the way to give you a little more access into this area. So the clutch line is done. We're ready to fill the cylinder now and bleed the clutch. So before we go to bleed the clutch, you want to make sure that all your lines and all your fittings are tight. So everything, including these two, and then also your bleeder fitting. So I need to tighten that, and then I'll be ready to go ahead and start getting pressure into the system. One of the cool little things I want to tell you about, and what I use almost every day, or every time I need to bleed a clutch, I use this setup, or even bleed brakes. So this is a motive power bleeder. This is probably one of the coolest things I've ever bought. This thing will hook up directly to the cap on your master, and they make all these adapters. Like this, for example, is the Tilton master cap. This is for a Willwood master cap. This is for a Strange master cap. And then this one will adapt to any OEM. See, it has that taper cone in there, and then you can put this under the master and cinch it down so it seals up. This thing is awesome. This thing will put pressure in through the top and push all the air out down through the bottom. It like eliminates any chance of having air in your system. So this thing takes, you know, maybe 30 seconds once you have it powered up to bleed the clutch out. And then also you can do this by yourself. So the reason I bought this is because I do a lot of the work here in the garage by myself when no one's around. So this helped me from having to have someone else come down and pump the brake or pump the brakes or pump the clutch pedal for me. This does it all by myself. Super simple to use. Like I said, probably one of the best things I ever bought. And one of the cool things is they have this pneumatic style adapter fitting here where you can adapt on all your different cap styles for this. So something I wanted to share that I use very frequently. And Motive isn't paying me to do this. I just love this product, so I wanted to share it. Okay, so the first step in this bleed, I'm gonna fill the reservoir up about 3/4 of the way, and then we're gonna hook up our power bleeder cap to the reservoir, and I'm gonna pump it up and give it some pressure. If you're looking for a fluid recommendation, I just use the stuff you can get at the regular Napa .3, .4 brake fluid. And one thing to keep in mind with brake fluid is it's caustic to paint. So you wanna make sure you clean it up. If you spill any brake fluid around in here, you wanna make sure you wipe it up immediately and get that cleaned up because it'll actually eat through paint. So be careful when you're doing this process. All right, so my power bleeder is hooked up with the cap, and all I gotta do now is just start pumping this up, and it'll start to build pressure on my gauge. And what I do is I take it up to about 15 pounds of pressure, and then I go ahead and lift the car back up and I break open the bleeder. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll get it up to 15 pounds, and then we'll go ahead and bleed out the bleed valve. All right, so you can see I'm just over 15 pounds of pressure and it's holding pretty steady. So I'm gonna go ahead and lift the car up and let's get this thing bled. All right, so you can see I have my drain can here and here's my bleed fitting. So I'm down underneath here. I'm gonna go ahead and put my wrench on here and crack this line, and we're gonna let it bleed out, let all the air come out, and you'll hear the spit and act up. And then after a little bit, you'll see that we get just a nice solid stream of fluid coming out of there. And once it's pretty consistent and smooth, you can go ahead and tighten it back up, and we're bled. And that's it. So I'm gonna go ahead and snug these up, and we're good to go. Now, if you do notice the pedal gets soft or anything kind of acts weird, I would maybe try to re-bleed again. But this, for the most part, works on the first try every time. Now that we're finished bleeding, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and secure these lines now permanently. So I'm gonna use some zip ties and just basically secure this bleeder line to the feed line just so it doesn't dangle down here into the roadway or whatever, drag. And then I'm gonna secure the main feed line that goes up into the engine bay, and you can just zip tie it to like one of your existing brake lines or your fuel line, just to make sure it doesn't move around. You want it to stay in place. One thing to keep in mind when you're securing these lines, and you can see I have them all nice and snug, is you don't want to push these lines back up into the bell housing, because there's a chance that they could technically, if you push them up in there and you make them kind of bend out towards the clutch, they could actually hit the pressure plate. So you want to make sure that you don't push extra line up in there. You want to keep these out here and snug and in place. So that's one of the reasons that you want to really secure these in place and make them nice and tidy. So that's it as far as bleeding the clutch. So now the only thing really left to do is to do the wiring, and that's going to be in the last step or last part of this conversion video.